Welcome back for another study in God's Word. We are in the book of Proverbs, and I thought what I would do today, instead of going through Proverbs verse by verse, we would look at it topically. And today we would take the topic of speech and words, because the book of Proverbs has a lot to say about that, and the Bible itself has a lot to say about that. The study guide talks about exclamatory words and phrases that his elders used, and the grandmother said, "Goodness, will I'll say," and another grandma said, "Oh," and another one said, "What in the world?" and one said, "Jiminy Cricket," and another one said, "Phooey." Well, of course, we know that some people can't speak without cursing, but I've been reading a book about General Grant. And General Grant did not curse. In the Civil War, he became the top general. In fact, he was made a lieutenant general, a position that only George Washington before it held. And Grant did not curse. He said that people curse when they get emotionally upset, and he said he felt it was far better not to get emotionally upset, to stay clear-headed. And so he did not believe in cursing. Now, of course, later on, General Patton, he did believe in cursing. But that impressed me about General Grant. And I'll say, too, about General Grant, he was a man of few words. He didn't say a whole lot. But when he did speak, he had something to say, and people listened to him. Now, the importance of words, we've all heard the little saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me." Well, that's absolutely not true. I've broken several bones in my life, and broken bones, you heal. But sometimes hateful words, you never heal. Several years ago, I broke some ribs, and it was very painful. It hurt to breathe, and to sneeze or to cough just about killed me. But after about 6 months, the ribs healed up, and I never really thought about it again. Now, I grew up next door to my uncle and aunt in Phoenix, and we had an uncle and aunt that lived in Texas, and they had 4 children, and sometimes the Texas relatives would come and visit us. And I remember one time, I wasn't present at this occasion, but my aunt got upset with one of the Texas cousins, and she really bawled him out and evidently used hurtful words towards him. Now, today he lives in Abilene, and I see him from time to time, and quite often when I see him, he brings up that incident and talks about how hurt he still is from what his aunt said to him. So a broken bone would have healed long ago, and this incident happened maybe 60 years ago, and he still hurts from it, and he probably will hurt from it till the day he dies. So sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's absolutely not true. Before we get to what the book of Proverbs says about speech and about the tongue, the book of James chapter 3 talks about the tongue, and James in verse 2 says, chapter 3 verse 2, "We all stumble in many ways. If anyone is never at fault in what he says, he's a perfect man and able to keep his whole body in check." And he goes on to talk about how a powerful animal like a horse, you put bits in their mouth and you can make the horse obey. Big ships are steered by a small rudder, and all kinds of animals and creatures have been tamed by man. Lions and tigers and elephants have been tamed. And I remember seeing a picture of a fella who evidently had tamed a hippopotamus and had it attached to his wagon, and the hippopotamus pulled him around. And I've seen pictures of children who have put a harness on turkeys and hitched the turkeys up to a wagon, and the turkeys pull the wagon. So, we've been able to tame all kinds of animals, but James in chapter 3 verse 8 says, "No man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison." And a whole lot of it gets back to this: if Samson on the throne, then our sinful nature takes over and we speak words we shouldn't speak. If Jesus Christ is on the throne of our heart, then our words will be wholesome. but the problem is self keeps trying to climb back on the throne. Now, picking up with Proverbs chapter 17 and at verse 27, it says, the intelligent person restrains his words, and one who keeps a cool head is a man of understanding. And I already mentioned the example of General Grant, who restrained his words and he kept a cool head even in the midst of battle. There's a song called Angry Words, Oh Let Them Never. Song full of very good meaning. It says, angry words, oh let them never, from the tongue unbridled slip. May the heart's best impulse ever, check them ere they soil the lip. Love is much too pure and holy, friendship is too sacred far, for a moment's reckless folly thus to desolate and mar. Angry words are lightly spoken, bitterest thoughts are rashly stirred. Brightest links of life are broken by a single angry word. And so the book of Proverbs tells us that an intelligent person restrains their words. And then verse 28 says, even a fool is considered wise when he keeps silent, discerning when he seals his lips. Now, we've probably all been around somebody who's very opinionated and also very ignorant, and they have lots to say on every subject, and a whole lot of it doesn't make sense. And the trouble with that is they tend to get tuned out, and if they ever have something important to say, people tend to don't listen to them. I remember back in 1960, there was a song called You Talk Too Much. It was by a fella named Joe Jones. And you can Google You Talk Too Much and listen to the song, kind of a catchy song. And he says, in the song it says, you talk too much, you worry me to death. You talk too much, you worry my head. You just talk, 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 talk. You talk too much. You talk about people you don't know. You talk about people wherever you go. You just talk too much. And the book of Proverbs says we should not talk too much. We should restrain our words. And then chapter 21, verse 23 says, the one who guards his mouth and tongue keeps himself out of trouble. And sometimes we can be our own worst enemy. Our sinful nature is real good at hijacking certain parts of our bodies and in destructive ways, and it can use the mouth and tongue in a destructive way. And he says, the one who guards his mouth keeps himself out of trouble. When we have emotionally difficult situations, it's easy to let our tongues get ahead of our judgment and say things that we should not say. One of my favorite movies, in fact, it may be my favorite movie, is the movie Hidden Figures. If you've never seen the movie, I would recommend it. It's about 3 black women in the 1960s who work at NASA. And one of them is a computer whiz, and one of them is a very brilliant engineer. But the other one, Catherine Goebbels, is a mathematical genius. In fact, when she was just a little girl, she was smarter than her teachers. And in the movie Hidden Figures, Catherine Goebbels, she has lost her husband and he's died some years previous. She has 3 little girls. And at a church picnic, she meets a man by the name of Mr. Johnson. And Mr. Johnson is a nice looking man and he's interested in Catherine. So he strikes up a conversation with her and he asks Catherine, what do you do for a living? And she says, well, I work for NASA and I do mathematical calculations designed to put a man in space and bring him back to Earth. And Mr. Johnson says, well, that's pretty heady stuff. I'm surprised they let a woman do that. Well, that's not the right thing to say. And Mr. Johnson right away can realize he said the wrong thing. And so he keeps trying to talk and he keeps trying to explain. And Catherine finally says, Mr. Johnson, if I were you, I'd stop talking right now. And so they don't have a very good introduction. Later on, though, Mr. Johnson does apologize, and later on they do end up getting married, but they don't have a very good start. So the one who guards his mouth and tongue keeps himself out of trouble. And then chapter 18, verse 19. An offended brother is harder to reach than a fortified city, and quarrels are like the bars of a fortress. Maybe somebody misunderstood our words and they're upset with us, or maybe they didn't misunderstand our words and they're upset with us. Well, it says they're harder to reach than a fortified city. And back when this was written, the cities were fortified. They had wide, tall walls, and if you wanted to reach the fortified city, you had to build battering rams and so on to go up and try to knock a hole in the wall. So it's very difficult. It says that's the way an offended brother is. And it says, and quarrels are like the bars of a fortress. In fortresses, they had swinging gates that would open up, but they would take a great big beam and lay it across the gates, and that would lock the gates in place. And so it says quarrels are like that. And then verse 20, from the fruit of his mouth, a man's stomach is satisfied. He is filled with the product of his lips. Now, the product of our lips are words, and words have the potential to make our lives richer and more satisfying, and they have the potential to do the opposite. And then verse 21 says, life and death are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. Life and death are in the power of the tongue. Back in the beginning, Adam and Eve had a choice between life and death. They had the tree of knowledge of good and evil that they were not to eat from, and they had the tree of life that they could eat from, and they rejected the tree of life and ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so the tongue, what kind of fruit will it have? What kind of fruit will it produce? And then in chapter 11, verse 13, it says, a gossip goes around revealing a secret, but a trustworthy person keeps a confidence. Here it talks about gossip. And I think a lot of people who would never think of gossiping sort of do gossip by some of the emails that they forward. And I've made the mistake of doing this. You get an email and you think, hey, this sounds good, and you don't check into it and you pass it on, and later on you find that the email is absolutely not true. And there's a lot of emails that are very slanderous. And there's a place called Truth or Fiction and a place called Snoops that we can check emails and see what they have to say about their truthfulness. And concerning gossip, when we tell somebody, it's called the rule of three. First, is it the truth? Second, is it goodness? And third, is it useful to the person that we're going to tell it to? And in James it says we're to confess our faults one to another, and we don't do that very much, and I think we don't because we don't really trust each other. We're concerned that we tell somebody something and they will gossip about us. And we can be sure if somebody gossips with us about another individual, we can be sure that they will gossip about us to somebody else. And it says, but a trustworthy person keeps a confidence. Some people can't keep a secret. Some people, they just have to tell. But a trustworthy person keeps a confidence. And then chapter 26, verse 20 says, without wood, fire goes out. Without a gossip, conflict dies down. Now we know from fires, and we heat our house with a wood-burning stove. If you don't put wood in, the fire will go out. And it says, without gossip, conflict dies down. Gossip keeps conflict going on. And another word for gossip here is the word grumbling. And sometimes people wouldn't gossip, but they do a lot of grumbling. And then verse 21 says, as charcoal for embers and wood for fire, so is a quarrelsome man for kindling a strife. To have embers, you got to have charcoal. To have fire, you got to have wood. And it talks about a quarrelsome man kindle strife, and they kindle strife by their words. And then verse 22, a gossip's words are like choice food that goes down to one's innermost being. Now, there's something about our sinful nature. I think we would rather hear something bad about somebody than we would rather hear something good about them. And it talks about how that gossip's like a choice food that we swallow greedily. People love to hear words that hurt another person's reputation. And then they go down to our innermost being. People remember those things, and whether they're true or not, they remember them, and that hurts the person's conflict that gets gossiped about. And reading the book about General Grant, he had a very difficult time because the news media back then was no fairer, no more honest than the news media today. And General Grant was greatly slandered, which did not help the war effort at all. And then verse 23, smooth lips with an evil heart are like glaze on an earthen vessel. Jesus accused the Pharisees of this. He told them that on the outside they were like a beautiful coffin, but on the inside they were full of dead men's bones. And you can take an earthen vessel and glaze it with a gold-colored glaze, and it looks like gold, but actually it's just still pottery. And then verse 24, a hateful person disguises himself with his speech and harbors deceit within. So the hateful person may say nice words, but inside them they're hateful. And in Genesis chapter 34, we have a case of this. Jacob had 12 sons and one daughter. The daughter was named Dinah. And one day Shechem raped Dinah, and then he wanted to marry her. And Jacob's sons hated Shechem and wanted vengeance, but they told Shechem and his people, they said, well, before you marry our sister, you've got to be circumcised. And so they used deceitful words to disguise their speech and harbor hatred. And when the whole city had done this, then I believe it was Simeon and Levi that went in and put to sword all the men in the city. Jacob was not pleased with that at all. And then chapter 10, verse 18 says, the one who conceals hatred has lying lips, and whoever spreads slander is a fool. Sometimes people will be consumed with hate, but they will cover it up with lying lips until they have an opportunity to do damage. Absalom did this. Absalom was one of the sons of King David, and another son of King David, Amnon, raped Absalom's sister Tamar. And Absalom didn't say anything about it. Absalom hated Amnon, but he concealed that with his lips. And then later he had the opportunity and he murdered Amnon. And then it goes ahead and talks about slander. And slander can murder a person's reputation. And it says those that spread it are foolish. And one reason they're foolish is that God will punish that sort of thing. And then verse 19 says, when there are many words, sin is unavoidable, but the one who controls his lips is wise. Jesus in Matthew 12:34 said that the mouth speaks from the overflow of the heart. And where a person talks a whole lot, it says sin is unavoidable, but it says that we should control our lips. And then chapter 12, verse 17 says, whoever speaks the truth declares what is right, but a false witness deceit. And, you know, God appreciates truth, and truth is what's right, but false witness, God does not. In 1 Kings chapter 21, we have the story with Ahab. And Ahab wanted a vineyard belonging to Naboth, and Naboth wouldn't sell. And Ahab went home and pouted, and Jezebel said, I'll take care of this. So she got some false witnesses to claim that Naboth had cursed God. And so Naboth was stoned, he was murdered, and Jezebel told Ahab, okay, go take your vineyard. It's all been taken care of. Well, Ahab goes to get the vineyard, and who should he meet but Elijah? And Elijah tells him, he says, where the dogs licked the blood of Naboth, the dogs will lick your blood. And that is exactly what happened. And then verse 18 says, there is one who speaks rashly like a piercing sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. So it talks about rash speech. And Moses knew something about rash speech because God told Moses and Aaron to speak to the rock to bring forth water, but instead Moses, he spoke to it all right, but he also struck it, and he said, "Must we bring forth rock and water?" And because he spoke rashly, he was not allowed to enter the promised land. And Solomon's own son Rehoboam, and this was written to Solomon's son Rehoboam. Rehoboam spoke very rashly. If we turn over to 1 Kings chapter 12, we read when Solomon died, Rehoboam became king. And the Israelites went to Rehoboam, and in 1 Kings 12 and about verse 4, they said, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." So Rehoboam says, "I'll give you the answer in 3 days." And so Rehoboam consulted the elders, and they said, "Do what the people say." But then Rehoboam consulted the young men that had grown up with him, and they were very foolish, and they said, "Don't do what the people say wanted. Tell them you're going to be tough." And so Rehoboam told them, when they came back after 3 days, he said, "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." And so the king didn't listen to the people. And because of that, the people rejected Rehoboam, and they made Jeroboam their king, and the kingdom then was split, and the northern 10 tribes were no longer under Rehoboam's control. And then verse 19 says, "Truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue only a moment." And so, the Lord appreciates truth, and truth lasts forever, but lies don't. And then chapter 25, verse 11, "A word spoken at the right time is like gold apples on a silver tray. A thing of beauty, gold apples on a silver tray." A word spoken at the right time. But the problem is, how do we know the right time, and how do we know the right words to say? I think it helps if we allow the Holy Spirit to live within us. Now, the study guide says we provide comforting words to a grieving person. And I would like to know some examples of comforting words to say to a grieving person, because I've heard people say things to somebody grieving that's not comforting at all. I've heard people say, "It's God's will that you lost your loved one." Well, that's not very comforting. I've heard people say, "Well, they're in a better place." That's not very comforting. When Job had all of his misfortune, in Job 2 and 13, we read that his friends came to him, and they tore their clothes, and they covered themselves with ashes. And for 7 days they sat, and they didn't say a word. And I think everybody would have been better off if they had left it at that. And sometimes when somebody's grieving, we want to provide comfort, but a lot of times the best thing is just say we're sorry and we love them, and so on, instead of trying to make it all right, because words aren't going to make it all right, not at that time. Then verse 12, "A wise correction to a receptive ear is like a gold ring or an ornament of gold." Wise correction to a receptive ear. Now I wonder, the song, "You Talk Too Much," if the guy sang that to his girlfriend, I wonder how receptive she would be. That might have broken up the connection between them. But a wise correction to a receptive ear. Galatians chapter 6 says, if somebody wanders from the truth, those who are spiritual restore them. But what about a wise correction to an unreceptive ear? Well, that doesn't work out near as well. And then verse 13, "To those who sent him a trustworthy messenger is like the coolness of snow on a harvest day. He refreshes the life of his masters." And sometimes people send a message and the messenger is not very trustworthy. And then chapter 31 verse 8 says, "Speak up for those who have no voice, for the justice of all who are dispossessed." And today, of course, that would be the unborn, who do not have any voice, but who their lives are taken away by abortion. And then verse 9 says, "Speak up, judge righteously, and defend the cause of the oppressed and the needy." Now I have about 4 minutes left, and I'd like to tell a story from Dr. Ironside's book. It's called "The Man Who Cursed on Calvary." Dr. Ironside's holding a meeting, and this took place maybe about 100 years ago. And his meeting's been going on for 2 weeks, and he notices that there's a handsome blonde young man who always occupies the same seat about halfway down the auditorium. And he would like to speak with the young man, but as soon as the service is over, the young man leaves. Well, one evening, the young man comes in late, and he has to sit on the front row. And so Dr. Ironside thinks, well, I got you now. And so as soon as the service was over, Dr. Ironside spoke to the young man and said, "Would you mind sitting down and talking for a few minutes?" And he said he could tell the young man didn't want to do that, but the young man was too polite to say no. So Dr. Ironside says, "I've noticed you here for a number of nights and wanted to speak to you. May I ask you if you are a Christian?" And the young man said, "No, I certainly am not." And he said, Ironside said, "Have you any desire to be?" And the young man said, "That's a difficult question. I can hardly answer that." And he said, "I've always been an atheist, but lately I've seen things that would make me be an agnostic." Now, the difference between an atheist and an agnostic is an agnostic says there might be God, but there's no way to prove it. And neither one of them believe in the Bible. And so the young man said that he was raised in an atheistic home. Both his parents were atheists. He went to Cambridge University, where he was a member of atheistic groups, and so on. And he said he was satisfied with that, but he said he'd been struck with the great change which had taken place in a man who had professed conversion some time before, and who he knew well. This man had been a drunkard and a gambler and a well-known character in the city. The change in his life had been marvelous, and everyone who came in contact with him realized it. "There's something there," the young man went on, "for which my philosophy cannot account. I would never have believed that so great a change could have come over anyone so suddenly. I know it's not willpower, for that man has tried over and over again to free himself from the liquor habit. But when he became what you call a Christian, he was delivered instantly. It has set me to thinking, and so I have been attending your meetings, and what I have heard and seen has convinced me that there must be some supernatural power at work. So now I call myself an agnostic rather than an atheist." And Dr. Ironside says, "Have you read the Bible?" And the young man says, "Well, I got a copy of the Bible, and I read it, but I just cannot make it out." And Ironside says, "Have you read about Jesus?" And the young man says, "Yes, I have, but all my life I've ridiculed the story of the miraculous birth and the resurrection and so on, that it's just hard for me to accept." But the young man says, "I have been reading the book of Isaiah, and I really appreciate the way Isaiah can sling the words around." And he says, "If I could only be a Christian by believing Isaiah, and I didn't have to believe the New Testament." Well, Dr. Ironside had him then, because he opened his Bible and he said, "I'm going to read you a passage from the book of Isaiah. It's about an unnamed man, but when I finish, I want you to tell me who I'm talking about." And of course, he read the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, which hopefully everybody is familiar with. And when Ironsides finished speaking, the man said, "Well, that must be Jesus." And so the young man wanted to read it for himself, and he did. And then he hurried out, and Ironside didn't see him for several days, but the young man came back about the 4th night, went right to the front. He was the first one up on the invitation, and he accepted Jesus Christ. And he said that he had been over in Palestine, he had been to Calvary, and said at that time he was such an atheist that he cursed on Calvary. But he said now he's read about Jesus in the book of Isaiah, and he said, "Jesus was wounded for my transgressions, bruised for my iniquities, and the chastisement of his peace was upon him, and with his stripes I am healed." So wonderful story about the man who cursed on Calvary, read about Jesus in the book of Isaiah, and was converted. So we'll let it